Have you ever stopped to consider whether your life has a deeper purpose than simply working, fulfilling responsibilities, and repeating routines? Perhaps amidst the hustle and bustle of everyday life, you've asked yourself, what am I here for? What's the point of all this? It's not unusual to feel that something is missing, that deep within us, there is a need for peace, direction, and meaning that no material goal can fully satisfy. It is precisely in these moments of searching that Jesus' words in the Sermon on the Mount take on immense value. Imagine the scene: a quiet hill, a diverse crowd gathered to listen to a man who spoke differently than all the teachers of his time. He didn't offer speeches filled with technical jargon or superficial promises. He spoke directly to the heart, with simple words yet charged with transformative power. Amidst weary fishermen, women burdened by marginalization, young people with questions about the future, and elderly people seeking comfort, Jesus delivered a message that resonated then and continues to resonate today, more than 2,000 years later. The Sermon on the Mount is not a simple religious discourse enclosed in history. It is a living guide capable of responding to our most contemporary struggles: stress, injustice, anxiety, the need to be loved and accepted. Through his words, Jesus reveals that true fulfillment depends not on what we possess, but on the condition of our hearts and the way we relate to God and others. Today, I invite you to explore this eternal message with us, to embark on a spiritual journey that shows us that true happiness, true peace, and true purpose are not found in power, wealth, or external achievements, but in a life aligned with the values of God's kingdom. This is not a distant message. It is a personal invitation to discover, to reflect, and to let these teachings transform the way we see life. To truly understand the power of the Sermon on the Mount, we need to transport ourselves to the original setting where Jesus spoke these words. Imagine a hillside in Galilee, not far from the sea, where the wind blows gently and the horizon seems to stretch on endlessly. It was an open place, accessible to anyone who wanted to approach. There were no majestic temples or auditoriums designed for grand speeches, only the simplicity of nature as a backdrop. This detail is important because Jesus' message was not intended for a privileged few within an exclusive enclosure, but for all who had ears to hear. The crowd that gathered that day was extremely diverse. Among the listeners were fishermen who had abandoned their nets after hearing Jesus' call, farmers who knew the harshness of the land well, women who were often invisible to society, curious children, elderly people burdened with experience, and also sick or marginalized people seeking a ray of hope. There were even men and women who had been rejected by the institutional religion of the time, who found in Jesus' words an acceptance they had never experienced before. That detail tells us about the radical inclusiveness of the message. While many teachers of that time spoke only to those belonging to a select group, Jesus spoke to everyone: rich and poor, men and women, young and old, healthy and sick, devout Jews and curious foreigners. In Jesus' eyes, every person had incalculable value, and every heart was worthy of hearing the message of the kingdom of God. The original audience for the Sermon on the Mount actually represented all of humanity. And if we think about it, they weren't so different from us today. They too were burdened with daily worries. Will there be enough food for tomorrow? How to confront the injustice of those with greater power? What hope is there in the face of suffering and illness? These questions haven't changed much over the centuries. We, in the modern world, continue to search for answers to similar concerns. The Sermon on the Mount was not a discourse for intellectual minds seeking abstract theories, but for hearts yearning meaning, peace and direction. Jesus spoke to universal needs: the thirst for justice in the midst of oppression, the longing for comfort in the midst of pain, the search for purpose when all seems empty. Therefore, although it was spoken more than 2,000 years ago, it remains surprisingly relevant. Consider today's world. We live in a fast-paced society marked by competition, constant comparison, and the pressure to appear successful. Many pursue recognition, money, or power, yet still feel an emptiness that none of it can fill. Others carry emotional wounds, the injustice of having been treated as less than, or the frustration of seeing that, even though they try to do the right thing, life doesn't always respond justly. In the midst of all this, the words of the Sermon on the Mount burst forth like a balm, reminding us that true happiness does not depend on external circumstances, but on a transformed heart and a deep relationship with God. The hillside setting also teaches us something symbolic. Jesus chose to speak in an open place where anyone could approach and listen. There were no walls limiting access, no barriers separating one from another. That same spirit remains alive today. The message of the kingdom is not restricted to a particular group of people, but extends to all humanity. No matter your background, your economic status, your culture, or your past, in Jesus' words, there is a place for you. Furthermore, the image of Jesus seated on the hillside has a profound echo in the biblical tradition. In the Old Testament, Moses climbed Mount Sinai to receive God's law and transmit it to the people. Now, on this new mountain, Jesus not only transmits commandments, but reveals the fullness of the kingdom, interpreting and bringing God's will to a deeper level. It is as if he were saying to us, it is not just about following external rules, but about allowing the heart to be transformed by the love of God. This contrast is powerful. While many religious leaders focused on externals, appearances, rituals, visible rules, Jesus went straight to the interior, to humility, mercy, purity of heart, the ability to forgive and love even one's enemies. This was the true spiritual revolution that began on that hillside. Today, as we open the Sermon on the Mount, we are not simply reading ancient words, but listening to Jesus speaking to each of us in the midst of our realities. His teachings respond to our hunger for justice in a world where corruption and selfishness seem to dominate. They invite us to find comfort in the midst of tears, to discover that being a peacemaker is more valuable than winning an argument, and that true greatness is found in humility and service, not in arrogance or pride. The context, then, is not only historical, but profoundly current. If the crowds in Galilee found hope in those words, we too can find it today. In the midst of our personal struggles, in a world marked by divisions, conflicts, and stress, the Sermon on the Mount offers us a different path, a path of inner peace, of reconciliation with God and others, of purpose that transcends the immediate and connects with the eternal. Therefore, as we approach this message, let us not do so as if we were studying a lesson from the past, but as if we were listening to a voice that is still alive, calling us to live differently. The scene on the hillside becomes the scene of our own lives, and the crowds of Galilee become us, with our questions, our wounds, and our hopes. And in that place, Jesus continues, blessed. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Matthew 5:3. Being poor in spirit doesn't mean living in economic misery, but rather recognizing our profound need for God. It means admitting that no matter how many achievements, riches, or talents we have, without Him we are empty. In a world that values self-sufficiency and absolute independence, Jesus invites us to the opposite, to depend on the Father with humility and trust. The paradox is clear. True wealth begins when we accept our spiritual poverty. Jesus himself modeled this. Although he was the Son of God, he lived in constant dependence on his Father, praying, seeking his will, and trusting him every step of the way. Today, we can practice this beatitude by cultivating humility, recognizing that we don't have all the answers, asking for help when we need it, valuing the wisdom of others, and above all, turning our hearts to God in prayer. The promise is glorious. Theirs is the kingdom of heaven, not a distant future, but a present reality where God governs our lives. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Matthew 5:4. Jesus doesn't deny human pain. On the contrary, he acknowledges it and gives it meaning. In a world that seeks to hide tears behind forced smiles and preaches that we must always be strong, Jesus declares, blessed those who dare to cry. The paradox here is that crying, a sign of weakness for many, becomes the path to divine consolation. Jesus wept at the tomb of Lazarus and in the Garden of Gethsemane, showing that pain is also sacred. He didn't avoid tears, but transformed them into a channel for hope and faith. Today, living this beatitude means not being afraid to express our emotions before God, entrusting our losses to Him, and also accompanying those who suffer, being instruments of comfort. The promise is clear: they will receive consolation. Not superficial comfort, but the living presence of God that heals and restores. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Matthew 5:5. Gentleness is not weakness, it is strength under control. While the world values aggression, ambition, and domination, Jesus says that the true inheritance belongs to those who choose humility and patience. The paradox is striking. It is not the rulers who conquer the earth, but the meek. Jesus demonstrated this by entering Jerusalem riding a donkey, not a war horse. His meekness was not passivity, but an inner strength that didn't need to be imposed by force. Today we can practice gentleness by responding calmly when others seek to provoke us, by choosing peace over unnecessary confrontation, and by trusting that God will defend our cause. The promise is astonishing. They will receive the land as an inheritance, not as a conquest, but as a gift from a Father who honors humility. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Matthew 5:6. Hunger and thirst are basic, urgent, and intense needs. This should be our desire for God's justice, deep, constant, insatiable. In a world where injustice, corruption, and selfishness seem to triumph, Jesus calls blessed those who long for justice, not as revenge, but as the restoration of what is right according to God. Jesus lived it when he defended the oppressed, healed the marginalized, and denounced the hypocrisy of the powerful. Today we can live this beatitude by raising our voices against injustice, defending the weak, being honest in our work, treating others fairly, and seeking truth above convenience. The promise is firm. They will be satisfied. We may not see it fully in this world, but God guarantees that his justice will prevail. Blessed are the merciful, for they will obtain mercy. Matthew 5:7. Mercy goes beyond compassion. It is the ability to forgive, understand, and help, even when there is no merit. The world is often governed by the law of an eye for an eye, or you give me, I'll give you. Jesus breaks that logic and calls us to be merciful without expecting anything in return. He incarnated it on the cross, forgiving those who crucified him. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Today we can practice this blessing by forgiving an offense, by showing empathy instead of judgment, by reaching out to someone who has failed. The promise is powerful. They will obtain mercy. Whoever gives mercy receives it, because God himself pours out his forgiveness on those who know how to forgive. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Matthew 5:8. A clean heart doesn't mean perfect, but rather sincere, whole, and without duplicity. In a world full of appearances and masks, Jesus exalts inner transparency. The paradox is that the invisible, the heart, determines the greatest thing: seeing God. Jesus lived with absolute purity, without hypocrisy, without pretense, with authentic love and an undivided heart toward the Father. Today, we can apply this beatitude by being honest, avoiding double standards, purifying our thoughts and motivations, and seeking God with a genuine heart. The promise is sublime. They will see God, not only in eternity but also here, experiencing his presence in daily life. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. Matthew 5:9. The peacemaker is not someone who avoids conflict at all costs, but someone who actively works to build true peace. In a world that fuels division, resentment, and revenge, Jesus calls blessed those who restore relationships and promote reconciliation. He himself was the great peacemaker, reconciling humanity with God and breaking down barriers between peoples. Today, we can be peacemakers by mediating a family conflict, by promoting dialogue instead of verbal violence, by building bridges instead of walls. The promise is beautiful. They will be called children of God, because whoever creates peace reflects the very character of the Heavenly Father. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Matthew 5:10. Jesus doesn't hide the reality. Living according to the kingdom brings opposition. The world, which often applauds lies, ambition, and injustice, rejects those who live in truth. The paradox is that persecution, rather than being a sign of defeat, is evidence that the kingdom is present. Jesus was persecuted, defamed, rejected, and ultimately crucified for his faithfulness to God's justice. Today, although we may not face physical persecution, we may experience rejection, ridicule, or isolation for living with integrity and faith. Jesus reminds us that the reward is certain. Theirs is the kingdom of heaven. No matter what we lose here, the eternal inheritance is assured. Blessed are you when people revile and persecute you and falsely say all kinds of evil against you for my sake. Rejoice and be exceedingly glad, for great is your reward in heaven. Matthew 5:11-12. Jesus takes the beatitude a step further. He doesn't just speak in general terms, but addresses his disciples directly. Being criticized, mocked, or slandered for following Christ isn't a cause for shame, but for joy. The final paradox is that slander becomes a cause for joy because it confirms our identity in him. Jesus himself endured insults, lies, and humiliation, yet he remained steadfast in his mission. Today we can apply this beatitude by remaining faithful in the faith even when others don't understand, by continuing to do good even when criticized, and by remembering that our reward is not in human approval, but in heaven. The promise is great. Your reward is great in heaven. Taken together, the Beatitudes are a revolution of the heart. They are not superficial advice, but a spiritual roadmap that redefines true happiness. They show us that fulfillment is not found in what the world exalts, but in living with humility, compassion, justice, purity, peace, and fidelity to God, even in the midst of trials. Other key teachings from the Sermon on the Mount: you are the salt of the earth. You are the light of the world. Matthew 5:13-14. Jesus uses two everyday but powerful images. Salt preserved food and gave it flavor. Light dispelled darkness and made the path visible. Thus, his followers are called to be a positive influence and a living witness in society. In a world that often falls into indifference and moral darkness, Jesus declares that the identity of his disciples lies not in what they consume, but in what they contribute. The paradox is that simple people, without political power or wealth, are the ones who bring the flavor and light this world needs. Today, we can live it by being consistent with our faith, showing kindness in small actions, speaking out against injustice, and shining with integrity where others choose lies. The impact is enormous. Salt prevents corruption, and light guides those who are lost. When we live as salt and light, we reflect God's character and bring hope to a world in need. Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish but to fulfill. Matthew 5:17. Jesus did not come to abolish the law but to fulfill it. This is not a rigid list of external rules, but a path that leads to the heart of God. He shows us that true fulfillment is not found in appearances, but in inner transformation. The culture of that time valued legalism, strictly following rules to appear holy. Something similar happens today. Many seek to comply with the minimum or appear to be right, but without a real change of heart. Jesus breaks with that and invites us to live with authenticity. In practice, this means that our life of faith is not reduced to rituals or labels, but to living with love, justice, and fidelity. Jesus fulfilled the law by loving to the extreme, and he calls us to do the same. The impact is liberating. We stop living under the pressure of "I have to comply" and begin to live under the grace that transforms. But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother will be subject to judgment. Matthew 5:22. Jesus goes beyond the commandment, "You shall not kill." He reminds us that the root of violence is in the heart: anger, contempt, hatred. The paradox is that even without raising a hand, we can cause harm with our words and actions. In today's culture, anger and resentment are easily justified. I have a right to be angry. He deserves it. But Jesus calls us to heal from within, to reconcile before presenting our offering to God. Today we can apply this by seeking to resolve conflicts instead of fueling them, asking for forgiveness when we've hurt others, and cultivating patience in our relationships. The impact is transformative. Communities free of resentment, more united families, and hearts at peace. You have heard that it was said, "You shall not commit adultery." But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Matthew 5:27-28. Jesus addresses not only external action, but also internal intention. Purity is not a matter of appearance, but of thoughts and motivations. The paradox is that we can appear correct on the outside and still have a divided heart. In a world saturated with images, superficial desires, and fragile relationships, Jesus invites us to a profound purity, to care for the heart before appearances. Today, living this teaching means cultivating faithfulness in thoughts and actions, valuing people beyond their appearance, and building relationships based on respect and genuine love. The impact is healing, stronger relationships, freer hearts, and communities where the dignity of every person is honored. But let your communication be yes, yes, no, no, for whatever is more than these comes from evil. Matthew 5:37. In Jesus' time, it was common to reinforce one's word with solemn oaths to make it seem more credible. But he teaches that integrity must be so strong that a simple yes or no suffices. Today, we live in a world where promises are easily broken, where words are used lightly. Jesus reminds us that true spirituality is also measured by the coherence between what we say and what we do. Practicing this teaching involves being honest, keeping our promises, and speaking transparently. The impact is enormous: a more trusting society and relationships built on truth. Love your enemies, bless those who curse you, do good to those who hate you, and pray for those who spitefully use you and persecute you. Matthew 5:44. This teaching is perhaps the most radical of the Sermon on the Mount. Human logic dictates, love those who love you, hate those who hate you. But Jesus breaks that cycle of hatred and proposes a love without borders. The paradox is that true strength lies not in revenge, but in forgiveness and blessing. Jesus incarnated this on the cross, praying for those who crucified him. That incomprehensible love remains at the heart of Christianity. Today we can live it by choosing to forgive instead of holding a grudge, praying for those who harm us, and seeking the good even in those who hurt us. The impact is revolutionary: restored relationships, more peaceful societies, and a life that reflects the very heart of God. The Sermon on the Mount, beyond being a venerated biblical text recited in churches, is a living manual that unfolds in our everyday actions, in the way we treat those around us, and in the decisions we make even when no one is watching. Jesus didn't speak to scholars locked away in temples. He spoke to fishermen, farmers, mothers, young people, and the elderly. His message was designed to be lived by anyone, anywhere, at any time. Therefore, the true richness of these teachings is revealed when we stop seeing them as abstract ideas and begin to translate them into daily actions. Being salt and light today can mean something as simple as stopping your work to listen carefully to a colleague going through a difficult time. In a culture that rewards productivity over empathy, giving your time and listening is a powerful way to illuminate another's heart. Practicing mercy isn't always about grand gestures, but rather about small details. Offering a plate of food to someone you know is in need, sending an encouraging message to a discouraged friend, forgiving a mistake even when no one asks you to. Mercy is expressed in concrete actions that change the atmosphere of a home, a school, or an office. Living humbly can be reflected in recognizing that we are not always right, in asking for forgiveness without pride, or in accepting help when we need it. Jesus taught us that greatness lies in serving, and that the truly rich are those who recognize their need for God. Being a peacemaker, for example, can take the form of intervening in a family conflict, not to take sides, but to listen and guide toward understanding. Or it can mean being that calm voice in a work group where everyone is arguing, remembering that respect is more important than competition. Loving your enemies, perhaps the greatest challenge, can begin with the simplest things. Not responding with insults to a hurtful comment on social media, not returning insults with insults, but choosing silence or a calm word. It can also mean choosing to pray for the person who has hurt you, even if your heart doesn't feel it yet, trusting that this act opens the door to profound healing. The Sermon on the Mount invites us to a mirror to ask ourselves honestly, what does it mean for me to be salt in my environment? Am I adding flavor and preserving what's good, or am I fading into indifference? In what areas of my life do I need to be a light? In my family, in my work, in the way I use my words? How do I react to anger? Do I seek to resolve conflicts or let them grow into walls? Am I being honest in what I say and do? Is my yes truly yes and my no truly no? What place does mercy have in my life? Do I practice it in secret or only when others see me? How can I begin to take a step toward loving those who have hurt me? These questions aren't meant to generate guilt, but rather to raise awareness. They remind us that the gospel isn't a rhetoric to admire, but a seed to plant in our hearts and allow to grow into concrete actions. When a person decides to live these teachings, their gesture may seem small, but the collective impact is immense. Salt is not perceived by a single grain, but by the sum of all. Light becomes powerful when several lamps are lit together. Imagine a community where everyone chooses to practice forgiveness instead of resentment. Families would be closer, marriages more resilient, and children would grow up in a healthier environment. Imagine neighborhoods where people choose to share what they have, even if it's just a little. Loneliness would diminish, inequality would be reduced, and hope would begin to flourish amidst need. Imagine schools where students, instead of mocking the most vulnerable, choose to be peacemakers and advocates for their peers. Or workplaces where employees choose to speak honestly and honor their commitments, building trust and collaboration instead of rivalry. The Sermon on the Mount has this power. It not only transforms individuals, but when experienced in community, creates spaces that reflect the kingdom of God here and now. And that is the true revolution of Jesus' words. Changing the world begins with each person's heart. So far, we've seen how the teachings of the Sermon on the Mount translate into simple but meaningful actions. However, the most transformative thing happens when these practices cease to be an isolated effort and become a lifestyle, a way of seeing the world and relating to it. Few things are as impactful as genuine humility. Today, culture celebrates self-sufficiency and a perfect image. But someone who acknowledges their mistakes and learns from them conveys greater greatness than someone who always pretends to be right. A practical example. A leader at work who makes a mistake in a decision can, instead of blaming their team, publicly acknowledge it and thank others for their efforts. This gesture of humility inspires trust and opens the door for sincere collaboration. Jesus taught us to give without blowing a trumpet. Today, being merciful can mean anonymously helping someone in financial need, giving away gently used clothing without seeking recognition, or simply praying for another's life without them ever finding out. These hidden actions free the heart from pride and leave invisible but indelible marks. 3. Fidelity in relationships. In times when promises are easily broken, faithfulness shines like a beacon. It may be the faithfulness of a married couple who chooses to work together in the midst of crisis, or that of a friend who remains present in the most difficult moments. Every act of loyalty reflects the love of God, who never abandons his own. 4. Justice in small things. Many people think that justice is only served in the courts, but it also manifests itself in our daily decisions. By refusing to participate in gossip that harms others, by paying someone fairly for their work, by speaking out against a discriminatory joke, we are being fair. These small choices are seeds that build a more equitable society. 5. Peace in the midst of noise. Being a peacemaker isn't just about avoiding conflict, but creating an environment where calm reigns. It might mean turning off the television at home and dedicating that time to talking, listening, and praying as a family. It might mean maintaining a calm demeanor on public transportation, smiling at a stranger who's in a bad mood, and not letting tension get the better of you. In every space where we sow peace, we are reflecting the work of Christ. The Sermon on the Mount compels us to ask ourselves again, but now more profoundly, am I being consistent with my belief in the occult, or just when I'm being observed? How willing am I to interrupt my comfort to meet someone else's needs? How is my life inspiring or discouraging those around me? What words came out of my mouth today? Were they salt to build up or poison that wore down? Am I willing to forgive even when the other person doesn't acknowledge or ask for it? In what concrete ways can I be a peacemaker this week in my immediate surroundings? These questions act as beacons that illuminate the areas of our hearts that need to be touched by grace. Jesus didn't come to point out harshly, but to show us a path to fulfillment. But every step depends on our willingness to let His word penetrate and shape our lives. When an individual decides to live the Beatitudes and the teachings of the Sermon on the Mount, something almost imperceptible but real happens. The atmosphere around that person begins to change. Their responses, their actions, their distinctive choices generate curiosity and inspire others. Let's imagine some scenarios. In a family, a mother who chooses not to respond with anger when her children disobey, but with patience and loving firmness, creates a safer home. A father who doesn't give in to pride and apologizes when he makes a mistake teaches more by example than by 1,000 sermons. In a community, neighbors who decide to organize, not to criticize what's missing in their neighborhood, but to share what little they have, transform cold streets into spaces of fellowship. A single family that decides to open their home to pray or share a meal can ignite a spark that inspires many. In society, young people who choose not to fall into the trap of verbal violence on social media, who promote respect and dialogue instead of hatred, are sowing seeds of peace in a land marked by hostility. The impact is multiplied because every act of kindness becomes a testimony. The Sermon on the Mount is contagious. When one person begins to live it, others notice and are challenged to change. The most important thing is to understand that these teachings are not tasks we complete once and then forget. Being salt and light, practicing humility, living mercy, speaking with integrity, and loving our enemies is a process that is cultivated day by day. It is a lifestyle that is built on the everyday. In the brief conversation with the stranger on the bus, in the patience exercised in a supermarket line, in choosing to listen instead of interrupting, in silent prayer for someone who doesn't even know you need them. The Sermon on the Mount is more than a speech. It is an invitation to embody the kingdom of God here and now, in the small, in the ordinary. The Sermon on the Mount is not just a piece of spiritual wisdom to be admired from a distance, but a mirror and a compass. A mirror because it reflects our heart, revealing our most hidden intentions, attitudes, and motivations. And a compass because it guides us toward a way of life that transcends the ordinary, the immediate, and the fleeting. Knowing these words of Jesus is fundamental because it helps us answer the deepest questions that every human being, at some point, asks themselves: what is the true meaning of my life? How can I find peace in the midst of suffering? What does it mean to live justly in a world that so often seems unjust? Is it possible to love selflessly? Each teaching of the Sermon on the Mount addresses one of these concerns and offers an answer that, although challenging, opens the door to fulfillment. There is a big difference between to know what Jesus said and live what he taught. Many can recite the Beatitudes by heart or repeat the idea of loving your enemies, but true transformation occurs when those words descend from the mind to the heart and from the heart to action. Knowing these teachings is important because, 1. They break the illusions of the world. We live in a society that associates happiness with economic success, external image, or power. But Jesus shows us that true blessedness lies in humility, compassion, and purity of heart. By understanding this, we discover that the ways of the world are fragile and that fulfillment lies in the eternal. 2. They reveal the root of human problems. Jesus didn't just talk about external actions. Do not kill, do not commit adultery, do not swear in vain, but went deeper. He spoke about anger, lust, lying, and pride. Knowing this allows us to identify that the problem isn't just what we do, but what we cultivate in our hearts. 3. They give meaning to suffering. The Beatitudes teach us that even pain can be a place where God reveals himself. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted, reminds us that hope is not extinguished in trials, but rather strengthened. Knowing these words changes the way we deal with loss and grief. 4. They invite us to coherence. Jesus insisted that our words and actions must be transparent, that our yes be yes and our no be no. Understanding these teachings helps us build coherent lives where what we say is supported by what we do. The most important thing is to understand that these teachings are not tasks we complete once and then forget. Being salt and light, practicing humility, living mercy, speaking with integrity, and loving our enemies is a process that is cultivated day by day. It is a lifestyle that is built on the everyday. In the brief conversation with the stranger on the bus, in the patience exercised in a supermarket line, in choosing to listen instead of interrupting, in silent prayer for someone who doesn't even know you need them. The Sermon on the Mount is more than a speech. It is an invitation to embody the kingdom of God here and now, in the small, in the ordinary. The Sermon on the Mount is not just a piece of spiritual wisdom to be admired from a distance, but a mirror and a compass. A mirror because it reflects our heart, revealing our most hidden intentions, attitudes, and motivations. And a compass because it guides us toward a way of life that transcends the ordinary, the immediate, and the fleeting. Knowing these words of Jesus is fundamental because it helps us answer the deepest questions that every human being, at some point, asks themselves: what is the true meaning of my life? How can I find peace in the midst of suffering? What does it mean to live justly in a world that so often seems unjust? Is it possible to love selflessly? Each teaching of the Sermon on the Mount addresses one of these concerns and offers an answer that, although challenging, opens the door to fulfillment. There is a big difference between to know what Jesus said and live what he taught. Many can recite the Beatitudes by heart or repeat the idea of loving your enemies, but true transformation occurs when those words descend from the mind to the heart and from the heart to action. Knowing these teachings is important because, 1. They break the illusions of the world. We live in a society that associates happiness with economic success, external image, or power. But Jesus shows us that true blessedness lies in humility, compassion, and purity of heart. By understanding this, we discover that the ways of the world are fragile and that fulfillment lies in the eternal. 2. They reveal the root of human problems. Jesus didn't just talk about external actions. Do not kill, do not commit adultery, do not swear in vain, but went deeper. He spoke about anger, lust, lying, and pride. Knowing this allows us to identify that the problem isn't just what we do, but what we cultivate in our hearts. 3. They give meaning to suffering. The Beatitudes teach us that even pain can be a place where God reveals himself. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted, reminds us that hope is not extinguished in trials, but rather strengthened. Knowing these words changes the way we deal with loss and grief. 4. They invite us to coherence. Jesus insisted that our words and actions must be transparent, that our yes be yes and our no be no. Understanding these teachings helps us build coherent lives, where what we say is supported by what we do. When we understand what Jesus taught in the Sermon on the Mount, we acquire an awareness that cannot be easily extinguished. Even if we try to ignore it, the words remain in us like a seed. When we feel anger, we remember that He called us to reconcile before we present our offering. When we are tempted to judge, we remember that with the same measure we will be measured. When we struggle to forgive, we remember that we must love even those who hurt us. This awareness doesn't leave us indifferent. It disturbs us, challenges us, awakens us, and this awakening is the beginning of a new life. We might think that these teachings, spoken more than 2,000 years ago on a hillside in Galilee, are far removed from our modern reality, but if we look closely, we will see that they have never been more necessary than now. In a world full of violence, hearing "Blessed are the peacemakers" is an urgent call to build bridges instead of walls. In a society that idolizes the image, hearing "Blessed are the pure in heart" brings us back to the value of authenticity and transparency. In the midst of so much division, hearing "Love your enemies" becomes a revolution of love that disarms hatred. In times of uncertainty and fear, hearing "Do not worry about tomorrow" is a reminder to rest in God's provision. Knowing these words is like having a lighthouse in the middle of a storm. It doesn't take away the rough seas, but it gives us direction and hope. Another fundamental aspect of understanding these teachings is that they are not designed only for our personal lives, but to be shared. A person who lives with hope spreads hope. A person who practices mercy inspires mercy. A person who walks in humility gives others permission to do the same. Therefore, knowing the Sermon on the Mount is not about accumulating spiritual information, but rather receiving a legacy that must be transmitted through words, gestures, and lifestyle. Each generation needs to see it embodied in those who believe, because more than just a discourse, it is a journey. Understanding the teachings of the Sermon on the Mount is like opening a window in a dark room. One may have lived for years with certain ideas about what it means to be happy, righteous, or spiritual, but when Jesus' words ignite in the heart, everything takes on a different dimension. These are not abstract concepts or distant theories, but a direct invitation to transform the way we live our daily lives. And this is where their importance lies. Not in the mere fact of hearing or remembering them, but in allowing them to penetrate to the depths of our decisions and emotions. In every phrase, Jesus is challenging not only the culture of His time, but also ours. While the world shouts that strength, wealth, and external success are the key to fulfillment, He whispers that the truly blessed are the humble, the merciful, those who know how to weep, those who build peace. This contrast is not minor, it is a head-on clash of visions. Knowing Him gives us the possibility of choice, of consciously deciding what kind of life we want to cultivate. Ignoring Him condemns us to repeat the same mistakes of the world, chasing mirages that sooner or later vanish. Furthermore, these teachings do not remain on a personal level, but affect everything we touch. A person who has allowed the Beatitudes to shape their character does not respond the same way to injustice, does not give up easily in the face of pain, does not harden themselves in the face of an enemy. A community that lives the spirit of the Sermon on the Mount begins to become an oasis amid the dryness of indifference and selfishness. Where there was once division, reconciliation emerges. Where there was loneliness, companionship appears. Where there was resentment, forgiveness flourishes. Therefore, knowing these words is not a spiritual luxury, but an urgent necessity for the present. In practice, all knowledge that is not embodied ends up being sterile. We can repeat by heart, "Blessed are the peacemakers," and at the same time respond with shouts and insults at the first disagreement. But when that knowledge becomes awareness, when we truly recognize that we are called to be instruments of peace, then our way of seeing and acting changes. A family conflict is no longer seen as a battle to be won, but as an opportunity to sow reconciliation. A difference of opinion at work no longer becomes a war of egos, but fertile ground for mutual respect. That is what makes knowing these teachings so vital. It allows us to see different options, paths we would otherwise not even consider. The importance of this also lies in the impact it has on future generations. Every time someone decides to live in accordance with the Sermon on the Mount, they are leaving a legacy that transcends. A son who sees his father ask for forgiveness learns more about humility than 1,000 speeches. A mother who decides to bless someone who has wronged her teaches more about genuine love than any book. A young person who renounces revenge and chooses to forgive shows with his life that Jesus' message did not remain on a hillside in Galilee, but remains alive and transformative today. Knowing him is, then, sowing seeds for the future, because what we practice today will be remembered and repeated tomorrow. But there is something more. These teachings are a refuge in times of storm. When life is shaken, when suffering, loss, or injustice strikes, remembering Jesus' words gives us a sense of purpose that the world cannot offer. Knowing that those who mourn will be comforted does not take away the pain, but it gives hope. Knowing that those who hunger and thirst for righteousness will be satisfied sustains us when all seems dark. Knowing that those persecuted for the sake of truth are assured of the kingdom gives us the strength to remain steadfast when circumstances invite us to give up. Knowing this is vital because it becomes an anchor amidst the rough seas of life. Each teaching of the Sermon on the Mount functions as a moral and spiritual compass. It helps us distinguish the essential from the accessory, the true from the illusory, the eternal from the fleeting. Without them, we run the risk of losing our way, of investing our energies in things that are unfulfilling, and of building on shifting sands. With them, we learn to build on rock, on a foundation that will not shake. This is the great difference between living informed and living transformed. Knowledge without practice remains just pretty ideas. Knowledge that becomes life changes destinies. And here lies the most important thing. Knowing the Sermon on the Mount isn't about accumulating spiritual phrases. It's about allowing each word to become a personal calling. It's about listening as if Jesus was speaking today, at this moment, directly to our hearts. It's about understanding that his message wasn't just for peasants, fishermen, or marginalized people of 2,000 years ago, but also for us, with our modern worries, our social networks, our work pressures, and our family conflicts. Therefore, knowing these teachings is essential because they remind us who we are, what we seek, and where we are going. They invite us to return to the essential, to what truly fulfills the soul. And although the world offers quick shortcuts to a feigned happiness, Jesus' words show us a slower, deeper, but authentic path, a path that transforms, liberates, and never fades. Knowing and applying these teachings also helps us recognize our own fragility and the need for constant growth. Every day we face decisions that can erode our peace or strengthen our integrity. Perhaps it's an argument at work, where pride tempts us to respond harshly, a family conflict that stirs resentment, or an opportunity to act unjustly for personal gain. In these moments, remembering Jesus' words becomes a silent guide, reminding us there is a different way, one that doesn't seek to impose itself but rather reflects love, humility, and justice. It's not about being perfect, but about being mindful, about not letting life drag us along without direction. Furthermore, knowing these teachings connects us to a broader vision of existence. It reminds us that our actions, even the smallest, have an impact that goes beyond the immediate. When we decide to be merciful to a partner, when we offer patience to a child who doesn't listen to us, when we choose to forgive rather than return the offense, we are sowing something that can flourish much later, often without us even seeing it. It is a silent investment in goodness, an action that doesn't need recognition to be valuable. Thus, the everyday becomes sacred ground where the gospel can be lived out in a tangible way. Living these teachings also transforms our perception of pain and difficulties. In a world that demands quick answers and immediate solutions, learning that those who mourn will be comforted, or that the persecuted will be comforted rewarded, teaches us to wait with patience and trust. Every trial becomes an opportunity for inner growth, an occasion to put humility, mercy, and faith into practice. Knowing the Sermon on the Mount gives us tools to interpret life differently. Not as a cruel accident, but as a process in which every experience, however difficult, can be a channel for learning and transformation. Everyday stories powerfully illustrate this truth. Consider someone who decides to be a peacemaker in their community, a young person who would typically have responded with verbal aggression to their peers' insults, but who remembers Jesus' teachings and chooses to calm things down, listen, and engage in dialogue. At first it seems insignificant, but soon others join in, tensions ease, and an atmosphere of respect and cooperation begins to build. Or consider a mother who chooses to forgive her children's mistakes rather than react with immediate anger. Her home becomes a space where trust and open communication are fostered, and the children learn to mirror that same behavior in their future relationships. Even at work or school, small actions based on these teachings have a multiplying effect. Deciding to be fair, keeping one's word, and treating everyone with respect and empathy creates an environment where others feel valued and safe. Consistency between what we say and what we do builds trust and transforms dynamics that would otherwise have been tense or destructively competitive. Knowing these teachings allows us not only to identify opportunities to act well, but also to recognize when we are straying from the path Jesus proposes. Knowing the Sermon on the Mount also protects us from superficiality. Modern life bombards us with contradictory messages. Success is measured by what is visible, happiness by what is immediate, and justice by what is best for each person. Jesus reminds us that true fulfillment lies not in appearance or external approval, but in cultivating an integral heart and living with purpose. Every decision we make to apply these teachings moves us away from superficiality and closer to what truly matters: a coherent life, full of meaning and aligned with eternal values. Therefore, the more we understand and reflect on these words, the clearer it becomes that their value lies not in the information they provide, but in the transformation they bring about. The wisdom of the Sermon on the Mount is practical. It teaches us to act with humility, mercy, integrity, patience, and unconditional love. It's not about following a rigid code, but rather about allowing our daily lives to become a reflection of what we have learned, and for every action to be a testimony to the truth and love that Jesus proclaimed more than 2,000 years ago. But that remains relevant today. Even when we feel weak or insecure, knowing these teachings offers us a solid frame of reference. It reminds us that we are not alone, that there is a perfect model to follow and a clear path forward. It gives us the strength to face injustice without resorting to violence, to forgive without expecting anything in return, and to be a light in the midst of darkness. Every action based on these teachings has eternal value, even if the immediate results are not visible. The importance of knowing them lies in the fact that it allows us to live with intention and purpose, rather than reacting automatically to life's challenges. A deep understanding of these words also fosters resilience and hope. It reminds us that suffering and difficulties are not a punishment or an insurmountable obstacle, but an opportunity to grow, to practice patience, faith, and mercy. It teaches us to value the invisible: right intention, a pure heart, honest speech, and generous action. Every conscious choice to live by the Sermon on the Mount strengthens our ability to face life with confidence, integrity, and love. Knowing and living these teachings makes us agents of transformation. A single person who chooses to embody these words can generate changes that multiply like ripples in a pond. Every act of kindness, every gesture of forgiveness, every moment of humility and patience becomes a tangible example that others can follow, inspiring positive change in their surroundings and in the community. Therefore, their importance is not limited to personal growth, but extends to collective impact. The lives of others are influenced by our decision to live with coherence and love. Knowing and living the Sermon on the Mount not only transforms us internally, but also connects us with a life legacy reflected in the examples we find in the Bible. When we read about Jesus, we can see how he not only taught these words, but also embodied them in every action. For example, the humility he preached was constantly manifested. He did not seek titles or recognition, but bent down to wash his disciples' feet, showing that true greatness lies in serving. This act, which might seem surprising even for its time, reminds us that knowing these teachings involves changing the way we exercise our leadership and treat those around us. In our daily lives, this can translate into simple gestures: acknowledging the merits of others at work, helping a neighbor without expecting a reward, or listening attentively to someone who feels ignored. Humility is not limited to fine words. It translates into concrete actions that impact lives. Mercy, another cornerstone of the Sermon on the Mount, also has biblical examples that teach us how to live it. Let us recall the story of the paralytic who was lowered through the roof to Jesus, Mark 2:1-12. The man's friends did not hesitate to seek help, and Jesus, seeing the faith of those accompanying him, healed the paralytic. This act shows us that mercy involves action, commitment, and attention to the needs of others. Knowing these words allows us to act in a similar way. It is not enough to feel compassion, but we must translate it into concrete actions that alleviate suffering and generate hope. In modern life, this may mean accompanying a grieving friend, providing help to a family member experiencing financial difficulties, or simply offering our time to those who feel alone. Forgiveness, which Jesus repeatedly emphasized, is another example that illustrates the importance of knowing and living these teachings. On the cross, while suffering unimaginable injustice, he said, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." Luke 23:34. This moment shows us the depth of love and mercy that the Sermon on the Mount calls us to practice. Knowing these words gives us the strength to forgive those who have hurt us, even when it seems impossible. In our daily lives, this might mean forgiving a colleague who publicly humiliated us, reconciling with a friend who betrayed us, or deciding to release old resentments that bind us and prevent us from moving forward. Knowledge becomes freedom and transformation, because in forgiving, we not only free the other, but also ourselves. Purity of heart, another key principle, also has biblical examples that help us understand its relevance. Jesus said, "Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God," Matthew 5:8, reminding us that it is not enough to follow external rules. What matters is the internal intention. Let us think of Mary, the mother of Jesus, whose willingness to accept God's plan with humility and faith reflects this purity of heart. In daily practice, being pure of heart involves acting with integrity, not manipulating others, being honest in our words and actions, and maintaining consistency between what we think, say, and do. Every action born from a pure heart becomes a silent testimony to the kingdom of God. Being a peacemaker is also reflected in the lives of biblical figures. Jesus constantly sought to mediate and reconcile, even among those who doubted him. His teaching on peace and reconciliation invites us to intervene constructively in conflicts, seeking understanding rather than imposition. In modern life, this may mean intervening in a family dispute with calm words, listening carefully to each side before passing judgment, or mediating workplace conflicts to seek fair and equitable solutions. Understanding these teachings gives us the tools to act wisely and lovingly, and reminds us that every peacemaking action has a ripple effect on our community. Another powerful example is found in the teaching on justice and integrity. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus calls us to seek justice and not to live according to what men consider right. Daniel, in the Old Testament, is an example of someone who remained upright even in a hostile and corrupt environment. His faithfulness to God and his commitment to the truth, even in the face of death threats, show that living with integrity and justice is not easy, but it produces lasting and admirable results. In everyday life, this teaches us that acting fairly, keeping our promises and maintaining honesty, even when the world seems to reward cheating or manipulation, is the path that leads to inner peace and genuine respect from others. Even the teaching of loving one's enemies finds practical examples in Scripture that inspire us. Joseph, sold by his brothers and betrayed, did not choose revenge when he had power in Egypt. Instead, he forgave them and cared for them. Genesis 45:4-15. Knowing and meditating on these stories allows us to see that the principles of the Sermon on the Mount are not theoretical or unattainable, but rather living examples of people who faced real challenges and responded with love, mercy, and consistency. They teach us that loving one's enemy is not an abstract idea, but a concrete act that transforms relationships, communities, and hearts. The impact of knowing and applying these teachings is also reflected in what happens in our daily lives in a practical way. Every act of kindness, forgiveness, humility, patience, or integrity adds up to a more harmonious environment. The influence is not always immediately apparent, but it has a multiplying effect. One act inspires another, and thus, little by little, spaces are built where light and hope begin to prevail. Knowing these words allows us to identify every opportunity to act differently from the world's norm, to choose paths that reflect God's heart, and to live purposefully in a time where superficiality and haste often obscure what is essential. Ultimately, knowing and living the Sermon on the Mount is not merely an act of intellectual learning. It is a call to live transformatively, to practice principles that change lives, communities, and generations. Biblical examples show us that this path is possible, that there are models to follow, and that the decisions we make every day, however small, reflect the greatness of these teachings when put into practice with faith, love, and consistency. Every action, every gesture, every word built on these principles leaves a mark that transcends time and circumstance and reveals the eternal power of Jesus' message. If this video inspired you, made you reflect, or you simply enjoyed it, I invite you to subscribe to our channel. You'll receive more life-transforming lessons, practical advice to apply in your daily life, and messages full of hope and purpose. Don't forget to activate the bell so you don't miss any of our content. Join our community and walk with us on this journey of faith and growth.